You've really sent a ton of stuff to dig through. It's all fascinating, but I have to admit, a little overwhelming.
Oh, for sure.
But there is a common thread running through it all, and it's how we're trying to wrap our heads around AI. How to control it through policy and regulation. And that gets especially tricky when we're talking about disinformation.
Absolutely. It's a minefield out there. And the sources you send, it's like a whole buffet of different viewpoints and approaches. It's actually quite a task to try to boil it down to what's really essential.
Exactly. And that's what we're aiming to do in this deep dive.
Yeah.
We want to extract those key insights and help you navigate this crazy, complex landscape. I mean, just the sheer volume of articles and research you've given us, it really shows just how much brain power is being poured into this and just how tangled the issues are. But as we were sifting through everything, three main themes kept popping up that we really need to unpack. So first off, how do we even define disinformation now that AI is in the picture? I mean, that's a whole can of worms right there. Then there's the question of what are media organizations and other key players actually doing about AI-driven disinformation? Are they
Oh,
just throwing up their hands?
right.
And lastly, what are the policy responses on the table? And, what are the roadblocks to actually making effective regulations? I mean, how do we get this genie back in the bottle?
Well, thinking about it, it kind of reminds me of this image that one of the sources mentioned. It was from, believe it or not, a Pentagon press conference on Afghanistan. And some journalist asked a seemingly straightforward question, but instead of a simple answer, the Pentagon's spokesperson put up this unbelievably convoluted diagram. I mean, talk about a spaghetti mess.
Oh, wow.
Lines going everywhere, arrows pointing every which way. But it actually kind of brilliantly captured how difficult it is to explain something really complex in a way that's simple and clear. And, I think that's something we have to keep in mind. We want to make this deep dive as clear as possible. But the whole area, AI and disinformation, it's inherently intricate. So we're going to have to acknowledge that up front.
Totally. It's like trying to untangle a giant ball of yarn.
Exactly.
All right, so let's jump in.
Okay.
And let's start with the most basic question, the foundation of everything else. What exactly is disinformation in this world where AI is just everywhere? One of your sources, it talked about a model developed by First Draft News. What's the key distinction that they make?
Well, they draw this very important line between misinformation and disinformation.
Okay.
And for them, misinformation is essentially information that's false or inaccurate. Think about things like wrong facts, misleading context,
Uh-huh.
even just honest errors. It happens,
Yeah,
right?
right.
The key missing ingredient in misinformation is intent.
Okay.
It's not necessarily being spread to deliberately cause harm.
So like if a news outlet gets an election result wrong, I mean, that would be misinformation.
Exactly. A mistake, hopefully one that gets corrected quickly,
Right.
but it's not driven by some calculated desire to mislead or hurt people.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. Now, disinformation's a whole other animal. This is where you have that falsity, but it's coupled with this deliberate intention to cause harm. So it's not just wrong, it's intentionally wrong, and it's designed to mislead, to create some kind of negative consequence. And it's often amplified, spread far and wide through social media and traditional news outlets.
So it's like weaponized misinformation.
Exactly. It's misinformation with an agenda.
Okay. So that element of malicious intent, that's really what separates the two.
Right.
Now, your sources, they also touch on these older forms of digital manipulation, like think back to all the Photoshop tricks. So how is AI-driven disinformation different from that? I mean, we've been messing around with images digitally for ages, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely. You're right. Your sources actually have some great examples. Remember that golden brown photo in the Sunday Times magazine where they completely airbrushed someone out? Or that, well, kind of bizarre Vanity Fair cover with Leonardo DiCaprio cuddling Nut the polar bear?
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It was kind of weird.
And even that shot of, I think it was a celebrity, riding a horse for the Sunday Times magazine. They did some tweaking there, too. These were definitely digital alterations. And some of them even sparked debates, about journalistic ethics, artistic license, that kind of thing. And the interesting thing is, these examples are nearly 20 years old.
Wow, really?
Yeah, so this idea that digital manipulation is something new, well, that's just not true.
Right.
It's been around for a while. However, what really sets disinformation apart, even compared to those older examples, is often the systematic goal to inflict harm, and on a much wider scale. So while those photoshopped images, they might have been misleading, maybe exercises in creative license, they weren't typically part of some coordinated campaign, to undermine an election or spread some dangerous conspiracy theory. And that's where that intent to cause harm, that becomes so crucial in defining what disinformation really is.
Okay, so it's not just about the tools themselves, it's also about how they're being used
Right.
and the intent behind that use.
Exactly.
Now, your sources also talk about how the whole online environment has become this perfect breeding ground for disinformation. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. I think if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, we have to consider the sheer explosion of online channels, what the EU calls very large online platforms, or VLOPs. In the beginning, there was this kind of optimistic view that the internet and these platforms would be a force for good, promoting openness, free exchange of ideas, democratizing information.
Oh, yeah. Remember the early days of the web? It felt like everyone finally had a voice.
Exactly. But what we've actually seen is that this huge increase in channels, it's also created this incredibly fertile environment for those who want to spread disinformation. And their motives might be political, financial, or something else altogether. But these platforms, they act like incredibly powerful megaphones. They amplify both the good stuff and the intentionally false content, and they broadcast it to massive audiences.
So it's almost like the promise of more information has backfired.
Hmm.
We're drowning in a sea of information, and a lot of it is deliberately harmful.
Yeah, it's a real paradox. And this information overload, it actually feeds into another issue the sources bring up, a growing skepticism towards traditional media.
Right.
When people are constantly bombarded with content from every direction, it's really hard to know what to believe. And that leads some to question even long-established, credible news sources. It's almost like the sheer volume of noise makes it harder to hear the real signal.
Right. The signal to noise ratio has gone completely haywire.
Exactly.
Now, you also mentioned this concept of platformization in your notes. Yeah. And you even bring up Nicholas Negroponte's book, Being Digital. That takes me back. What was so insightful about that book that makes it relevant to this conversation today?
It's amazing how spot on Negroponte was, and this book was written way back in the mid-90s. He basically predicted so many of the big changes we're seeing now. Things like the rise of streaming, the decline of, physical media, the super personalized content feeds, and even this consolidation of power in the hands of telecom giants. One of your sources even points to Comcast buying NBC as a prime example of this trend playing out. So essentially, platformization, it describes how these online giants have become the main way we access and share information. And that has huge implications for how disinformation spreads.
Kind of spooky how accurate he was back then.
Yeah.
So this shift in how we consume information, thanks to these platforms, it's also opened the door for disinformation to spread more easily.
Yeah, that's one of the downsides.
But your notes also raise this really fundamental challenge, which is that we aren't always rational when it comes to information. So how does that play into all of this?
Well, it challenges a lot of our assumptions. I mean, we often think that people will naturally seek out and accept accurate information, but the sources you sent, they highlight the paradox of populism, where
Yeah.
people who, on the surface, seem like they'd be hurt by certain political ideologies, end up strongly supporting those ideologies.
Yeah.
And that suggests that there are other forces at play, things beyond just pure logic and reason.
So emotion trumps logic sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's this thing called the backfire effect. One of the sources mentions it, referencing the book The Political Brain. And this is really fascinating. It's this idea that if you try to correct someone's misinformation, even if you have solid evidence, it can actually strengthen their incorrect belief.
You're actually making things worse by trying to correct them.
It can happen, yeah. It's like when people are faced with facts that contradict their deeply held beliefs, they dig in even harder. And that makes the techniques used to spread disinformation even more effective.
Oh man, that is discouraging. So what you're saying is we're not as rational as we like to think we are. And your source even brought up the resurgence of flat earth theories as an example of people rejecting basic, well-established scientific facts. It's hard to believe that's still a thing.
I know, right? It really shows you how even fundamental truths can be challenged in this current information environment.
Wow. So we're not always logical. And it can be counterproductive to try to correct people's misinformation.
Hmm.
And then, we've got these specific techniques being used to spread disinformation. What are some of the ones that really stood out to you?
Well, one that seems particularly insidious is the idea of repeating the same message over and over again across different channels.
Oh, yeah. Like a constant drip, drip, drip.
Exactly, it wears people down. And even if something is demonstrably false, that constant repetition can create this sense of familiarity, even a kind of acceptance over time.
It's like the old adage, repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth.
That's the idea. And when you combine that with distractions, pulling attention away from the real issues and sidestepping logical arguments and trying to sow doubt in science and establish facts, well, it creates a very challenging environment for truth to get a foothold.
Right, right. It's like they're playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers.
Exactly. They're using sophisticated tactics to manipulate people.
Okay, so we've got repetition, distraction, and attacking the credibility of reliable sources. That's already a pretty potent cocktail. But then you add echo chambers to the mix. Now, your source mentions that there's still debate about how much echo chambers really exist, but the basic concept is pretty clear, right?
Yeah. While the research might be nuanced, the core idea of echo chambers is that a lot of people mostly consume media and engage with online communities that reinforce what they already believe.
Right.
And they tend to avoid or filter out perspectives that challenge their worldview. And the source even asks you, the listener, directly, do you consciously seek out media outlets that present different viewpoints?
It's a good question to ask ourselves. I know I tend to gravitate towards sources that align with my thinking. It's comfortable.
Yeah.
Your source mentions someone reading the Daily Mail, and then there's that classic joke from Yes Minister about newspaper readership.
Oh, right. The one where they go through the different papers, like The Guardian is read by people who think they should run the country. The Times is read by people who actually do run the country. The Financial Times is read by people who own the country. The Daily Mail is read by the wives of the people who own the country.
That's the one. It's funny, but it also highlights how different media outlets cater to specific audiences and often reinforce existing biases.
Exactly. And it makes you think about how often we actually expose ourselves to ideas that might make us uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's definitely food for thought. Now, your source also touches on the tricky issue of relying on those in positions of power as sources of truth, especially when they themselves can be sources of misinformation. It seems particularly relevant these days.
Absolutely. When trust in authority figures erodes, and when people in positions of power actually spread or amplify misleading information, it creates a huge problem for society. It becomes incredibly difficult to separate fact from fiction.
So we're dealing with inherent biases in how we seek out information. Plus, the backfire effect can make things worse. We might be stuck in echo chambers, and even our leaders might not be reliable sources of information. That paints a pretty bleak picture. And then on top of all of that, your source emphasizes that simply debunking misinformation after it's already out there often isn't enough. Why is that?
Well, as the source puts it, fact-checking, although important, often has limited reach. The debunking article might be on a smaller platform, a less popular website, so it might not reach the majority of people who saw the original false claim.
Right.
It's like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. Once misinformation is out there and has taken hold, it's almost impossible to completely undo the damage.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
And you also mentioned that anecdote about the Facebook meeting where they were discussing taking down disinformation networks. It was just 20 people and 20 posts.
Right.
I mean, that really shows the scale of the problem these platforms are facing. It's like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon.
Exactly. It's a massive undertaking. And then you have the added layer of platform ownership. Facebook owns Instagram and WhatsApp. And there's a real concern that the way these platforms are designed, their business model, it prioritizes user engagement over the accuracy of information.
Right. So keeping people scrolling and clicking is more important than whether the information they're consuming is actually true.
Yeah. There's this inherent tension between profits and social responsibility. And the interview with the Facebook executive kind of hints at that. So it's possible that the platforms themselves are unintentionally fueling the problem.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, and it's a pretty daunting picture. Now let's shift gears and talk about what media organizations and others are actually doing to respond to AI-driven disinformation. Your source suggests that self-regulation by the platforms and AI developers hasn't been very effective. Why is that?
Well, the main takeaway is that without some kind of built-in incentive, self-regulation just doesn't seem to work. I mean,
Yeah.
there's not always a strong business case for prioritizing accuracy over, maximizing user engagement or profits.
Right. So if the algorithms are rewarding sensationalism, regardless of truth, then self-regulation is always going to be an uphill battle.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned this idea of intelligence augmentation, or IA, in your notes,
Yeah.
and how it's distinct from fully autonomous AI. So how does IA relate to content creation and the spread of disinformation?
Well, the crucial difference with IA, as John Markoff's work points out, is that it still involves humans. Humans are still in the loop. So while AI tools are getting really good at generating text and images, even videos, we're still in a phase where AI mainly assists humans. It augments our capabilities. It's not completely autonomous in creating content, especially when it comes to understanding things like nuance, context, intent. So there's still a human element that we can potentially hold accountable.
Okay, so even with AI, there's still a human element involved,
Yeah.
at least for now.
Right, for now.
So what are some of the policy measures being discussed to address disinformation? You mentioned media and AI literacy earlier.
Yeah, there's a lot of focus on that. The idea is to give people the critical thinking skills they need to evaluate information effectively,
Oh,
to understand how AI systems work, and to recognize the tactics used in disinformation campaigns. One of the sources even mentions a project that our colleague Peter will be leading in this area.
that sounds like a crucial step, empowering people to be more discerning consumers of information. But what about supporting traditional media? Your source points out that they're facing some serious financial challenges.
Yeah, that's a big problem. Traditional media is really struggling financially. And your source highlights that in the UK, a whopping 90% of digital ad revenue goes to those US-based platforms.
Wow, 90%.
Yeah, it leaves very little for UK media outlets. And that really limits their ability to invest in things like fact-checking and investigative reporting, especially when platforms are actually cutting funding for those things. It's like the very platforms contributing to the disinformation problem are also undermining the institutions best equipped to fight it.
Yeah, talk about a catch-22.
Right.
And then there's the fundamental challenge of even defining disinformation.
Right.
How do you create a legal definition without accidentally creating something like a ministry of truth?
That's the million-dollar question. Who gets to decide what is and isn't disinformation? And what even qualifies as legitimate media? Your sources highlight the dangers of letting governments become the arbiters of truth, referencing concerns raised by the EU. And you have examples like Trump constantly using the term fake news to discredit established news outlets.
Yeah, that's a slippery slope for sure. But your source also mentions using algorithms for real-time debunking, or at least to slow down the spread of disinformation. Is that a realistic solution?
It's definitely an intriguing possibility, and technologically it's becoming more and more feasible, but the complexities are huge. Who programs these algorithms? What biases are they carrying?
Mm-hmm.
And what about the risk of accidentally flagging legitimate content as disinformation? There are some pretty telling examples in your sources.
Yeah, like those photos being removed from Instagram, the Helmut Newton ones, they were art photography?
Right, and then there was that iconic napalm girl photo from the Vietnam War that got flagged too.
Yeah, I remember that.
And those examples show the limitations of AI moderation. An algorithm designed to detect nudity or violence, it might not be able to tell the difference between art, historical documentation, and something that's truly harmful.
Right. Context is everything.
Exactly. And then there's the concern that AI providers might manipulate search results or auto-suggestions to favor their own interests. Your source mentions the Dixie example, which is a bit murky.
Yeah, that was a head scratcher.
But it suggests a subtler form of influence, right? And then you have the specific examples with YouTube's auto-suggestions, like the limitations they had for bands like Cock Robin and Revolting Cocks.
Oh, yeah.
And remember the problems they had with the word gay in auto-suggestions? For names like Gay Talese, even Marvin Gaye got caught up in that.
Right.
It shows how these algorithms, even unintentionally, can shape what information we see.
And it highlights the fact that these systems aren't neutral. It seems like every solution comes with its own set of problems.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the policy responses and, the inherent challenges of regulating this fast-moving area. You mentioned 4 key areas of concern about AI implementation that go beyond just the media landscape. What are those?
Well, when you think about AI more broadly, the policy concerns are pretty huge. Your source identifies 4 main areas. First, you have the potential impact on jobs and the job market.
Right.
Then there's the whole complex question of who's responsible when AI systems make decisions or take actions. And of course, there are the implications for privacy and human rights. And finally, there's the overarching need to protect users and ensure fairness across different sectors. The main point is that we need to think about the worst case scenarios because AI is becoming more integrated into our lives every day.
Absolutely. And your source gives some real-world examples, like that AI scandal in the Netherlands with the social welfare benefits.
Oh, yeah. And the UK government halting those AI-driven benefits programs. Those cases really highlight the potential for serious harm when AI is implemented without carefully considering the ethical implications and the potential for
It's
bias.
a cautionary tale. And then you mentioned Yuval Noah Harari's concerns about the potential misuse of AI.
Right. And then there was Google reversing its pledge not to use AI for weapons or surveillance,
Yeah.
and the possibility of AI being used in criminal activity like drug trafficking. It's a reminder that this technology, it's powerful and it can be used for good or for bad.
A double-edged sword, for sure.
Mhm.
Now, you listed some of the key legal documents the EU has put in place to address digital services and AI. Can you give us a quick overview of those?
Sure. The EU has really been trying to get ahead of the curve on this. Some of the key pieces of legislation are the Digital Services Act, or DSA, which aims to make online platforms more accountable. Then there's the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, and that one's focused on curbing the power of the big tech companies. And then, of course, there's the big one, the Artificial Intelligence Act, the AI Act. It takes a risk-based approach to regulating different AI applications.
Hmm.
And you also have the European Media Freedom Act, the EMFA. That one's all about protecting media pluralism and independence. And there are recommendations from the Council of Europe on the responsible use of AI. But interestingly, your source points out that a lot of countries still don't have comprehensive national legal frameworks for AI.
Wow. So the EU's taking the lead, but there's still a lot of work to do at the national level.
Definitely.
Now, you mentioned that the AI Act itself isn't focused on media specifically.
Yeah.
What are its main priorities then?
So the AI Act, it uses something called a risk-based framework. It prioritizes regulating AI applications that are seen as posing the highest risk to fundamental rights and safety. And things like military applications and healthcare, those are considered higher risk than the media sector, even though the impact of AI in media and disinformation can be massive.
Right. I mean, we've talked about how damaging disinformation can be to society.
Absolutely. And there are still some big questions about how the AI Act will actually be implemented.
Like what?
Well, how will they monitor and enforce its provisions, especially across different member states?
Right.
How will companies comply with the regulations? And how will they evaluate and update AI systems over time, given how quickly the technology changes? A law is only as good as its enforcement.
Totally. And then there was that surprising omission of copyright in the AI Act. I mean, that seems like a pretty big oversight.
Yeah, it's a huge gap. And it includes not just regular copyright, but also the copyright to someone's voice and likeness.
Wow.
So think about it. Your image, your voice, could be used without your consent or compensation. That's a potential legal nightmare waiting to happen.
It certainly is. But there are some other efforts being made, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned the Council of Europe's recommendations and that new Mass Media Act in Slovenia.
Right. Those are positive developments. The Council of Europe's recommendations offer some good guidance on the responsible use of AI in journalism.
Uh-huh.
And the Slovenian proposal, it actually has a whole chapter on AI in media. It could be groundbreaking, maybe a model for other countries.
Okay, that's good to hear. And then there's the upcoming Paris AI Action Summit, which is focused on sustainability. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, the focus on sustainability at the summit, it highlights the environmental and resource implications of AI. It might seem unrelated to disinformation, but it emphasizes the need for a holistic approach to AI governance. We need to consider its impact in every area, including the environment.
Right, it's all connected. And then there's that recent Financial Times article that said the EU might be scaling back some of its planned AI regulations to encourage investment.
Yeah.
That sounds like they're trying to strike a balance between regulation and economic competitiveness.
Exactly. It's this constant struggle between fostering innovation and mitigating the risks. The article suggests that the EU is worried about putting European companies at a disadvantage if the regulations are too strict.
Yeah.
But of course, there are concerns about loosening those regulations and opening the door for abuse.
Right. It's a tough balancing act. And then your source mentions the Dear Comment Project, which found that a lot of existing European codes of ethics don't even mention AI specifically.
Yeah, that's a blind spot.
It seems like our ethical frameworks need to catch up with the technology.
Absolutely. We need to update our codes of ethics to reflect the realities of AI.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. And as that Pentagon diagram showed, it's a complex issue with no easy answers.
For sure.
We talked about defining disinformation in the age of AI, the responses from different groups, and the policy landscape. It's a lot to digest.
It is. We're dealing with